Fuerstman, and the title of my presentation is Practice What You Preach, Explicitly and Implicitly Teaching for Social Justice. Dissent is patriotic. This has become a really popular phrase in our current political reality, and it was also featured on a protest sign created by a teacher in the school that I student taught in, the Cambridge Port School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This phrase and this value is really essential to the pedagogy at the Cambridge Port School, and it's essential to my values as an educator. I believe in teaching my students that they can and should challenge injustice in the world and defy structures they believe to be unfair and unjust in order to maintain our democracy as just for all people. And I explicitly teach this to my students in a variety of ways. These are different books that I've read with my students this year, among many, about changemakers and activists who have challenged injustice and oppression in our world. This is an assignment that came at the end of a social studies unit about the Transcontinental Railroad, in which students had to create a campaign for justice for a group of people that was somehow treated unfairly or oppressed by the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So here's a poster for the Lakota, and over there is a poster for Chinese workers who worked on the railroad. Again, I was in a 4th grade classroom at the Cambridge Port School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the school really emphasized social justice inquiry and project-based learning. I had a class of 18 students, 9 girls and 9 boys, in a really socioeconomically and racially diverse classroom. And also, my class really struggled with behavior. We had frequent discussions about how we could be more respectful with one another and how we could create a safer classroom community. So, while I was explicitly teaching my students that they should defy structures that are unfair in the world, I noticed that within schools, we often reprimand defiance, and we often praise compliance. And I felt that I was sending my kids mixed messages if I was explicitly teaching them one thing, but then implicitly teaching them within my classroom management that to be a good student, they had to be compliant with the rules in the classroom. And I wanted to explore this tension in my research. So my research question became, how can I make my classroom management more socially just? How can I make my explicit messages match, or how can I make my implicit messages match my explicit messages that I'm sending my students? And I approached this question through 2 different methods of data collection. On the one hand, I engaged in some teacher reflection about my own teaching practices to consider how I'm engaging in unjust or just classroom management practices. And one way that I did that was creating an invisible teacher knapsack of teacher privilege based off of a pretty well-known invisible knapsack of white privilege. It's a list of unconscious privileges that one can hold as a white person that one might not realize. And I thought, what are ways that I hold power within the classroom that I don't necessarily realize and that I rest on in my teaching? So I created this list to consider that and possibly figure out ways that I could redistribute power to my students. I also regularly journaled and reflected on my teaching, and I recorded lessons and analyzed the transcripts to consider what was just or unjust. And then what was really important to me was to get my students' input about my teaching. So I administered a survey, which 16 out of 18 of my students took, to get their feelings about our classroom management system, about fairness in our classroom, and to see what they thought we could change. The first part of the survey had a series of affirmative statements about fairness in our classroom, such as I am treated fairly, I have a voice, I am listened to, things like that. And students decided whether they strongly disagreed all the way to strongly agreed. And then the second part of the survey consisted of a list of open-ended questions that most students responded to, but not all, depending on whether or not students were taking the survey with all the students or if they were out at that time and took it at a later time where they had less time to finish it. And these really got to the meat of what do students like about our classroom, what don't they like, what is fair, what is unfair, and what can we change. And my results were really surprising. My biggest finding was that based on the survey data, my students experienced fairness in the classroom based on gender. I found that my boys found the classroom to be really unfair. They wanted more choice overall, and they viewed the student-teacher relationship as a banking model, which is a term coined by Paulo Freire, which basically means that the teacher is the ruler, the student obeys, the teacher is depositing knowledge into the student's brain, a really one-directional, authoritative relationship, not what I want to be doing in the classroom. And then I found that my girls said that the classroom was fair. They wanted more student-to-student respect overall, and they viewed the student-teacher relationship as a problem-posing model, which Freire is another term by Freire, and it basically means that teacher is also learner, learner is also teacher. We are co-creating knowledge and expectations in the classroom, a more democratic model, which is what I want to communicate to my students. But through my survey, it became clear that this was only reaching some of them. And then just the evidence of where this came from in my survey, I took note of how many times each child disagreed with a statement in the first part of the survey, and on average, boys disagreed 3.7 times, and girls disagreed an average of 1.1 time. And then I really wanted to highlight these two questions about the role of the student and teacher because I found their answers to be fascinating. I highlighted key words in their answers, and if you look at what boys said the role of the student is, they used words like serve, obey, do what teachers say, follow the rules, whereas girls said, they also said follow directions, but their respect was more towards everyone. So they said respect everyone, listen to teacher and classmates, learn, but also teach and have a say. And then boys said the role of the teacher was to make us do work, boss us, to be the king or the ruler, and to prepare us, which are really like standout words there. Whereas girls said the role of the teacher is to help us, be kind, show respect, be fair, to teach but also learn and to listen, to pay attention. This is what I want to be as a teacher, but clearly only my girls saw that was what I was doing. My second finding is that based on my own reflections, I hold some unconscious gender bias that comes out in my classroom management. I tended to over-discipline boys in my class and pass over or shortchange girls in my class. And here are just some excerpts from my journal of when I was coming to consciousness about this. I realized that the names that I was saying over and over in the day about behavior happened to be certain boys' names. And I thought about how damaging that must feel to hear your name over and over in a negative light, and how that would feel like your teacher is the king or the ruler and that things are pretty unfair. I found that I over-policed and unfairly assumed that certain boys were talking when they weren't. I found that I would look at a table with mostly girls, and they'd be talking, and I'd be less likely to move them than a table that had mostly boys. And I also found, when I was tracking conferences that I was making in writing workshop, I found that I mostly missed out on girls in my class academically in the week, so I would constantly be conferencing with the boys whose behavior always caught my attention because I also need to check in with them about behavior, but I missed out on the girls who weren't attracting my attention based on my behavior, but also needed academic support. And my final finding is that all of my students really deeply care about fairness, and they believe that in a fair classroom, students have freedom, they're treated equitably, they have choice, and they're respected. And this is really the bottom line for me moving forward. So some conclusions through all of these findings. While I wanted to make my implicit messages match my explicit messages, I found that those implicit messages were only reaching some of my students. And while I wanted to find ways to create moments of defiance in my classroom, I was reprimanding my most defiant students. Overall, I think it's really important too that I knew all of this going into my research. Like, I have read years ago research on over-policing boys in the classroom and underserving girls, and I knew it all, but I still did it unconsciously, which means that there are probably other unconscious biases I hold as a teacher, and it's my job to figure out what they are and to actively work to challenge them in my classroom. So to answer my question, how can I make my classroom management more socially just? I think I can make my classroom more gender relevant. What does that mean? We often talk about culturally relevant teaching in education, which is teaching based on students' cultures and live realities based on that. But I think it's also important to create a classroom community that caters to students' needs based on how they've been socialized in their gender, while also actively teaching them that gender norms are constructed and that they should work to challenge those norms. It's also really important for me to recognize that gender is a spectrum and not a binary, and my classroom also needs to include students that lie along that spectrum and not just at either end of it. So some new questions I have as I move into my next steps as a teacher. I'm wondering how I can support all of my students in my class by enabling them to learn while staying true to who they are. I'm really wondering how I can incorporate more movement into my teaching, not just as a movement break, as we often hear of in elementary classrooms, but as a route to learning, so that my students who are defiant because of movement could be learners and also move. I'm also wondering still how I can create moments of meaningful defiance in my classroom. And then finally, choice is really important to my students, I found in these surveys. So I want to figure out how I can enable students to have choice while also creating the structure that they need to learn. That is the end of my presentation. Any questions? Great.
The big one. Yeah. What is a moment of meaningful defiance in the classroom? Can you share with us?
I would like to create a way where students can challenge expectations in the classroom in a thoughtful way. and in a way where they're backing their critiques up with evidence. Like I'd like to teach them across all subjects to really back up their views and their decisions, but to not be afraid to challenge our expectations in the classroom.
Could it also be like, let's just say a boy who says, oh, it's math time now. Like, I'm so beat. You know,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yes.
Is that okay to say? And then you can say, you know what? Hey, everybody, maybe we need some movement.
Yes.
Let's all take
Yeah,
a 10-minute, you know, something or
Yeah,
whatever.
it includes not being afraid to share what you are feeling, and for me as a teacher to respond to that and to adapt what I'm doing based on those feelings in the classroom. Yes.
Do you think that this is something that you would have to adapt to different ages? Like, for example, I know right here we're going to be teaching high school and middle school. Is this something that you think is applicable to middle school and high school classrooms, though in a different way, or is it mostly something that we should be implementing in the early years?
I think definitely it's applicable anywhere. I think it's always important to create a democratic classroom where students feel as though they can voice their concerns and challenge expectations in the room. And I think gender norms are happening everywhere. They might be different as students grow older, but it's always important to stay attentive to that.
Just a comment, I would think at that age group, age 8 or 9, knowing how they, what their home expectations are. I mean, they're, excuse me, still so young
Yeah.
that they're bringing how, you know, what goes on at home into your classroom. I would think it might be valuable to say, especially when there's a, you know, an issue is, you know, how is this resolved at home? And then they answer and you say, well, we're going to resolve it differently here. We're going to find a different way, or, you know, just how powerful still at that age their home environment
Definitely.
will influence how they just bring that into your classroom.
Yeah, I think it's really important to communicate with families not only about academics, but also about behavior in their home and how they handle behavior in their home and how I would like to handle behavior in my classroom, and try to find a meeting point between those, not to completely shun what families do at home, but to try and meld them together in some way so that my classroom management is responsive to that as well. Yeah.
Just a little follow-up about the home thing. Have you ever considered, maybe next time you take a graduate program and you want to do a research question, about their order with their siblings? And like if a girl has 3 brothers, is she kind of looking at boys differently in terms of behavioral stuff? Or, you know, the other way around? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
it's just a whole other sort of open question that I mean, I'm not actually looking for an answer on it. This is just a comment.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to realize that the gender norms I was seeing in my classroom are not like across the board every child in the world. This was my classroom. So there are obviously various factors in students' lives and families in this school that created that dynamic, and it will differ for every classroom and every child in the school. Yeah.
I just wanted to also make a comment that you're getting 4th graders who've had all these other experiences, 1st through 3rd, so you're also getting the other ways that other teachers have handled it. So I suppose when you're presented with a brand new class, then you begin to make that change in environment and in culture from the very start, I would think. Because they're coming with, maybe in other classes, the teacher was the boss, maybe there was a lot of oppression. So you're dealing with not just a blank slate, but other experiences they've had.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is the end of our question period. Thank you.